Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be talking about one of my topical TBRs. If you're not familiar with my topical TBRs, definitely check out the intro video. Basically, I'm putting together a number of different reading lists that are on certain topics that I want to get through eventually. There's no time constraint necessarily. The list that I'll be discussing today focuses on the history of people of color generally within the United States. There are a couple of books that focus on European countries, but I do think that the content from those books is relevant to the United States and or is kind of a piece of a foundation of the United States since we came from Britain. The vast majority of the books on this list are written by people of color. This is particularly important when it comes to things like history and social sciences. There's been a long history of white professionals who tend to speak over the actual experiences of people of color or erasing them altogether. So it's really important that we actually have people of color in the process of writing down the history and doing social sciences within communities that they're knowledgeable about from a personal experience. This is by no means a definitive list of all of the books you should read on history of people of color. These are just books that I would like to read. There are a number of books that I have read that I think that you should read, but that's not what this video is about. If you're interested in different recommendations on this sort of thing, I will link to some really good videos that I've enjoyed by people of color recommending books that you should read on race and racism. I don't want to spend too much more time with introduction stuff because I have a lot of books to go through. I'm going to go through this list in roughly chronological order from where the books start to focus on. There will be a couple of exceptions in that. The first is Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Ibram Kendi. This looks like an extremely comprehensive book looking at ideas starting from the era of like race science all the way to contemporary. I've been really looking forward to this book. I've heard lots of good things. I actually plan on reading it aside the version that's available for children, stamped, so that I can possibly use that in some capacity since I do some online history classes and I have tutored kids before. The next book that I have is an ebook. That is Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life by Karen and Barbara Fields. This book is a sociological look at the ways that race is created and recreated, looking at history, policy, and culture. Along the same theme of creating race, we have Superior, The Return of Race Science by Angela Saini. It's my understanding that this book goes through and talks about what race science was and how it became popularized, but also how a lot of people are returning to some of these ideas and why. For those of you who don't know, race science is the result of a number of white scientists early on in the 17 or 1800s who decided to categorize different races. One prominent thing that they did was phrenology. They would measure people's skull sizes and they would say that certain aspects of skull size were related to certain aspects of personality or temperament, despite the fact that they had no science to back up why those things were equated. The numbers were wildly off and different people got different results. But of course the end result of all of them was that white people were here and black people were here, and so that was used to validify the already existing power dynamic in which Africans were enslaved. The next book that I have on this TBR is The Making of Asian America by Erica Lee. This book goes through and talks about how Asian American identity has been perceived and how they've been treated by law. So this goes through, I have a feeling that it's going to focus a whole lot on anti-immigrant policies that heavily focused on Asian people. The next book that I have is An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Oritz. As the title implies, this looks at American history from the Native American perspective. Instead of looking at the colonizer's perspective, it's looking at things through what Native Americans actually dealt with. I'm particularly interested in getting to Making Asian America and the Indigenous People's History of the United States because I am not nearly as familiar with Asian Americans or Native Americans as I am how racism impacts Black people. I got a sociology degree, I took a class in race, and it was a phenomenal class, but it really was just focused on African Americans. So as a teacher and researcher, I need to expand my knowledge base so that I understand the historical background of Asian Americans and Indigenous people. Next up on this TBR is The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. This focuses on the Great Migration, which was an event basically where a lot of the population of African Americans originally lived in the South. There was about 80% of America's black population was in the South, and the other 20 were in the North. But throughout the course of just a few years, that ended up shifting to where 80% was then in the North and 20% in the South. And that was the result of a number of different factors, including Jim Crow laws, terrorism from the KKK, and job opportunities. I'm really excited to get this in-depth of a look at this problem. I've read about it in other books as just a very small piece of it, and I've seen a documentary that kind of hits on it, but it's not something that I've ever read a singular book focused on. I highly recommend checking out Jordan by Left on Red's review of this book. She was the reason that I ended up picking up this book. Then we have Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present by Harriet Washington. In a similar vein to that book, I also have a book that's available on Scribd that I'm interested in reading. It's actually focused on what's going on currently, so it's not necessarily looking on history as far back as this book is, and that is Reproducing Race, an Ethnography of Pregnancy as a Site of Racialization by Kiara Bridges. This is an ethnographic study looking at pregnant people in New York City and how the experiences of people of color are very different and based in racial biases that the medical community is perpetuating. The issue of how pregnant people are treated in the United States is particularly important. The US actually has a really high rate of complications and deaths from pregnancy compared to other higher income countries. And this issue is way worse when you look at people of color. So the next chunk of this TBR is going to be books focused on the 50s through the 70s. The first one of those that I have is Black Skin, White Mask by Frantz Fanon. This is a study looking at the basically psychological ramifications of white supremacy on black people. The next book that I have is The Blood of Emmett Till by Timothy Tyson. This is one of the few books that's not written by a person of color. However, I have heard some good things about this book. This looks extensively at the case of Emmett Till. There's actually some new stuff in this that wasn't heard before. It's really important to hear about and remember victims of racial violence. And it's also important that we realize how these things come to happen. It's not 1950 anymore, but white women are still putting black men at great risk for reporting things that are untrue simply because they were inconvenienced. Next book that I have is Waiting Till the Midnight Hour by Peniel Joseph. This is a history of the Black Power movement. It follows a number of different groups and leaders from the civil rights movement. I think this book is going to be particularly important because a lot of the black history that you get in public schools, or at least the sort of black history that I got in a southern public school, you got to hear about Rosa Parks and MLK, but you heard almost nothing about the Black Panthers and a lot of these other groups that were less palatable for white people. So it's really important that you get the full story. The next book that I have is more focused on Black feminism, and that is How We Get Free, Black Feminism in the Combahee River Collective by Kianga Yamada Taylor. First, it takes you through the Combahee River Collective's statement of purpose, and then she goes through and interviews a number of people who have been involved in the Black feminist movement. This focuses on what the Combahee River Collective did and the kind of impact that they had on Black feminism and how that can still be seen today. Next, I've got a few memoirs and other personal writings. First, we have the autobiography of Malcolm X, who was a crucial voice during the civil rights movement. Next, I have the autobiography of Assata Shakur, who was a member of the Black Panthers who was wrongly accused of committing a crime. This autobiography starts off with her experience being in police custody while also being hospitalized because she was shot by the police during the event in which she was accused of killing police officers, despite actual physical evidence that showed that her bones couldn't have been in a position where they could be shooting and aiming a gun, among other different things. But this goes back and forth between her experience after being arrested and accused and going back in her childhood, so you get to learn kind of in bits and pieces. I started this book back in December, and I ended up putting it down just in the little bit that I've read from this book. It is really incredible. Next we have Time on Two Crosses by Bayard Rustin. This is a collection of his writings. For those who don't know, Bayard Rustin was an essential organizer for Martin Luther King Jr. He's not often talked about because he was a gay man. Alongside being involved in civil rights, he did also do things for gay rights and was very prominent in the peace movement, the anti-war movement. Next we have another Black gay figure, and that is Audre Lorde. I have Sister Outsider, which is about her own experience and also thoughts and theories on oppression. She talks about being Black, being lesbian, being a mother, and being a survivor of cancer. I have read bits and pieces of this work before, but I have yet to read it from cover to cover. And then we have We Gon' Be Alright, Notes on Race and Resegregation by Jeff Chang. I am honestly not totally sure what the timeline on this book is. I kind of flipped through it a little bit and I saw 1975, 1960s in here a little bit, but I know that it definitely references stuff that's more recent. I'm really interested to see what exactly he has to say. I do know a decent bit about education and how schools have been resegregated, so I don't know if this is just focusing on that or if there's kind of a broader sort of resegregation going on. I would imagine with things like gentrification. I'm super interested in this book and I've heard a lot of good things. Now, I do want to acknowledge that there is a time gap here in books that I have that are focused on specific pieces of time. I do not have any books that are specifically focused on the 80s or 90s, but I did want to put it out there that this is an important time in history. I think that a lot of people don't know, or they maybe forget that things were going on at around this time. In particular, the war on drugs was really intensifying in the 80s and 90s, and this was when prison populations absolutely skyrocketed. I have read a few books on the topic, but I do want to expand and learn more, so I've actually got a separate list that I'm putting together for books that are focused on prisons and the prison industrial complex. Any books that I end up finding about the war on drugs will probably go on that book list. I will talk about that list at some point. That is a list that I need to research a little bit more and add books to, but I just wanted to acknowledge that because I didn't want anyone to think that there wasn't anything worth looking into or that I was overlooking the war on drugs. If you're watching this video and you're interested in learning more about prisons and mass incarceration, I highly, highly, highly recommend The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and I would spring for the new edition if you can, because the new introduction is fantastic. This book highlights stuff starting from the beginning of the country to now, and talks about how prisons were created and the like. I actually do really want to reread this, but like I said, I've got a whole nother list that I'm putting together that looks at prisons. So, I do have one book that's published in the 90s, and that is De Colores Means All of Us, Latina Voices for a Multicultural Century by Elizabeth Martinez. This discusses things like community organizing and activism from the Latina population, and also looks at different perspectives within that community of empowerment. I'm sure that there's a lot more. I haven't read it yet, so I don't know exactly what all they hit on, but I'm really excited to get to that ebook. The next book that I have is Killing Rage, Ending Racism by Bell Hooks. I'm not totally sure what all she says in here. I know she hits on the fact that oppressions are interlinked and different things like that. So I'm really excited to read this. Bell Hooks is one of the greats in women's and gender studies, so it's definitely going to be a good read. The next books that I have are really focused on the 2000s. First, I have We Were 8 Years in Power by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This focuses on what happened during Obama's presidency and the sort of backlash that he faced and that the whole Black community faced during this time. This would pair really well with White Rage by Carol Anderson. I've already read this and it was absolutely excellent. White Rage goes through starting at the Civil War and seeing how each time Black people were to get some sort of step forward or a little bit of rights, there would be kind of an extreme backlash to that. Now, I haven't read this particular Ta-Nehisi Coates book so I can't say for sure, but it looks like he's following a similar framework. And speaking of Carol Anderson, the next book on my list is One Person, No Vote by Carol Anderson. This is looking at voter suppression. This is going to look at kind of the history of voter suppression, but really it focuses on recent happenings. There was a specific bit of legislation in 2013 that made voter suppression even more of a problem. So this goes through and analyzes that problem and the scope of that problem. This is a pretty big book. And it is just focused on that one issue. The next book that I have is They Can't Kill Us All by Wesley Laurie. This looks at the more recent activism that's been happening within the Black community, specifically looking at Black Lives Matter and a lot of the police brutality that's been happening and highly publicized, especially starting around 2012 or so. The next book that I have isn't actually focused on the United States, and that is Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Edo-Lodge. This book focuses on race relations in Britain and goes through some British history and talks about how people of color have been influenced by policy. I thought that this was really important to include on this list because British history does still impact the United States. A lot of the things in early British history certainly impact the United States because a lot of settlers were British. But even the stuff that happened afterwards are still going to have an impact because Britain and the United States still impact each other politically. The next few books that I'm going to be focusing on actually look at race currently. I wanted to include contemporary voices in this list as well because 2019, a year ago, is still a part of history. Right now is still a part of history, so it's still relevant in that way, but also the whole point of looking at the history of race in the US is to understand how it impacts everything now, and these books really talk about what race is like now. So in reading these alongside the other history books, we can get a more complete picture. First, I have The Fire This Time, which is a compilation edited by Jesmyn Ward. This is a number of essays on what race is like in the United States right now. This is supposed to echo James Baldwin's work, The Fire Next Time. I read this in February, I believe, so I'm looking forward to see how this book is and what kind of callbacks it makes and the kind of connections that they have together. Next on the list is Thick and Other Essays by Tressie McMillan Cotton. This is a series of essays that she wrote looking at culture and the way that Black women are seen and treated. Next is Mistaken Identity, Rage and Class in the Age of Trump by Asad Haider. This work pulls from Black revolutionary writings, but talks about how race is currently and how we can see race currently using some of those writings, and he kind of emphasizes the need for solidarity in the current political situation that we're in. Next we have Latinx, The New Force in American Politics by Ed Morales. This book basically goes and talks about the way that the United States categorizes races, and it kind of questions that in a lot of big ways. The final book that I have is a memoir told in a series of essays, and that is What Doesn't Kill You Makes You Blacker by Damon Young. In it, he talks about his experience as a Black man and the sort of obstacles that he has to overcome. So that is it for my History of People of Color in the United States TBR. If you've read any of these books, definitely let me know what you think about them. If you have recommendations, let me know as well. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Bye.